Creativity does not exist in a vacuum. You have to practice it. It's just like yoga practice, that you have to practice creativity to have more creative ideas.
Welcome back to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. My name is Reka and I am your host. If you are a returning listener to my podcast, welcome. I am so happy and grateful for every single one of you who listen to this podcast every week or once in a while, or if this is your first time, welcome to this podcast. This podcast, Full-Time Yoga Teacher, was started about a year ago because I am a full-time yoga teacher for almost 10 years. And when I first became a yoga teacher, I knew I wanted to try this as my full-time thing. And I wasn't sure if it was possible. I wasn't sure how many people were working as a yoga teacher as a full-time job. I just wanted to know more information. I wanted to know how many classes I have to teach, what kind of insurance do I need, what's the normal rate that I should get paid for per class. And I try to ask these questions to people I found in my life that looked like they were teaching yoga as a full-time thing. But a lot of the times I had to kind of figure it out on my own. There just wasn't a lot of resources out there and not many full-time yoga teachers that I can ask questions to. So as I have been teaching yoga for full-time for quite some time now, I know many teachers and colleagues of mine who also teach yoga as their full-time thing, and also people who teach yoga part-time but used to be full-time, or who used to teach yoga but no longer teach yoga, or people who work in a yoga world and industry or wellness industry and make that into a full-time thing. So there's many different avenues you can take to be a full-time yoga teacher or to be in this yoga industry as your main source of income. And I wanted to interview these people all over the world so they can share their journey, their stories of how they got to where they are, what kind of challenges they overcame, and what are the lessons they learned to be where they're at right now. And these are the kind of information and podcasts I wish I had when I was a new yoga teacher to listen to. So I hope this podcast is helpful to you in some way, whether you are already a full-time teacher or maybe you are a part-time teacher. And there's no shame in being a part-time yoga teacher at all. I'm just sharing one of the paths for many yoga teachers who choose to make this a full-time thing. But being a part-time teacher and having another source of income from another industry, or maybe you are a mom and taking care of your family and that is your another part-time job. And all of these things are great, respected, and legitimized. And I am not by any means trying to promote being a full-time yoga teacher is this glamorous thing, or it's this beautiful Instagram influencer type of thing, because it is hard. It's not easy. I have seen many people try and not make it as a full-time yoga teacher, and it just sometimes doesn't make sense to be a full-time yoga teacher for many people. So that's kind of what we talk about in this podcast. I hope you are enjoying it, and if you're new, there are so many great interviews from last year that I did that you can go back to and listen to all of them and kind of find the commonalities of all of these teachers, how they made it to where they're at. All that to say, this month, January of 2025, I am doing 4-part short interview series with my friend Olga on the topic of creative sequencing. Last week we talked about what is creative sequencing, a little bit about pitfall, and this week Olga and I are talking about how to get more creative in your sequencing. How do you find this creativity in the sequencing? And then we get into pretty interesting topics here that hopefully will get your brain going in a way that you too can also find some ways to sequence creatively. And even though I don't consider myself a creative sequencer, you can hear me in this conversation that I have this realization that I am somewhat of a creative sequencer in a way that I bring in other modalities into my yoga class. So I hope you will also get some kind of aha moment in these conversations that Olga and I are having. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge and mention that I live in Long Beach, California, and right now, in real time, if you're listening to this podcast, and in real time, January of 2025, LA is experiencing devastating fire that has affected so many people's lives and burnt down their homes and neighborhoods. And I just want to take this moment to send out love and prayers for everybody who's been affected. It is very sad to see, and it's so close to home that we know at least a handful of people who have been affected by this fire. I know tragic stories and situations and circumstances are happening all over the world, and when it hits home, we really tend to feel the heaviness of it, and we really get to say I love you to the people we love and care the things that really matter to us, and maybe find more gratitude in all the amazing things that we have, and how can we continue to show appreciation and gratitude to everything that surrounds us. So I know it can be a difficult time, especially if you live in LA right now, but I want you to know that there are so many amazing community organizers and local businesses coming together to offer donations, volunteering work, place to stay, free food, free drinks, free services to people who are affected by this fire. And that is a beautiful thing to see, is how community come together and help one another. And I think that is so important right now, no matter where you live, is to really cultivate community where you are and continue to show kindness to others and be the best version that we can be in this challenging times. And hopefully practice of yoga, teachings of yoga help us stay grounded and centered during this time so that we can continue to show up as the best version of ourselves. So I am not going to do any announcement on what's coming up this week. It just doesn't feel right for me to promote anything this week. So I want everybody listening to know that if you ever want to reach out to me, message me about anything, or share resources that you want me to share to the listeners, you can always message me on Instagram at Reika Yoga, or message me through my website www.reikayoga.com. I hope you enjoy the conversation I had with Olga for the second week of Creative Sequencing series. I will speak to you on the other side. Welcome back, Olga, for another conversation about creative sequencing. So today we're going to talk about, has creative sequencing got a place in yoga?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. What do you think?
Definitely. I think so. I think that's what makes yoga so beautiful and can have such a big reach, because every teacher can bring their own creativity that kind of adds a little flair to their teaching. And there's so many people in the world who practice yoga that's going to be attracted to different teachers' style and maybe their creativity, or how they put poses together and sequences and transitions together. So I definitely do think creative sequencing has place in yoga. Although I guess depending on the style of yoga, right? Like we talked about last week, if you're practicing a set sequencing type of yoga practice, yogasana practice, then maybe not too much. Although maybe there's still a place for creativity, maybe in the way you cue or how you bring yourself to the teaching role. But yeah, definitely I do think there are space for creativity in yoga for sure.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. And just to link to what you were saying, how someone gets into their state of yoga can be different for different people. So while someone will need something on that day, something strenuous, someone else will need yin, someone else would need to just sit in meditation, and someone else needs to do intense breath work, right? So we have so many tools to help people find that place. And that's actually our goal as yoga teachers, right? So when it comes to the question, like, has creative sequencing got a place or is this yoga? You do see that on Instagram sometimes. And I always think that in the context of the physical practice, if we hear the opinion that something isn't yoga, we really need to ask the person how they define what real yoga is. And it's actually not that simple to define. So I don't know if you've read The Yoga Body. So The Yoga Body by Mark Singleton is a PhD research into the history of asana. And if you read that, you will find that the answer to this question, what is real asana practice or original asana practice, is actually very complex. So long story short, the physical practice has gone through a lot in its time, from being super simple and just taking a seat to being rejected as part of yoga, to then a serious moment of blending and intermingling with other movement disciplines. And all of this happened before yoga even came to the West and became a global trend. So the practice we engage in today on our mats emerged in a creative environment. So it doesn't really live in isolation to other movement practices, and some of them will be creative. And also, if you accept vinyasa as real yoga, I'm doing a lot of air quotes here, but not creative sequencing, then the question I would ask is, where do you draw the line between an acceptable amount of creativity and then too much? And if you're interested in this history of asana, I recommend reading the book by Mark Singleton. And you can also listen to Ferdows Munda has some amazing podcasts at Yoga Medicine where you can find out more about this history of asana. So that's my first thought about how does it fit into a yoga practice. Do you have any thoughts before I continue?
Yeah, definitely. I like how you connected how yoga, well, I guess this is me paraphrasing it, but yoga has always been evolving. It's been changing over time, over history. Different area has made influences into the yoga asana practice. So if you think about it, there has always been a creativity in yoga and yoga asana from the beginning, because I think it'll always still continue to change and evolve as we get older, and then the next generations and next generations. So like you said, that is already the creativity that we've been talking about.
Yeah, definitely. And also, you could go back in time and look at, like, I think the earliest set of illustrated yoga poses we have is medieval times. But the question then appears, like, is medieval times original enough for you? Or do you want to go back thousands of years and just look at what they had then, which wasn't illustrated at that point? So yeah, that question becomes so open-ended. And also, if you look at Pradipika poses, I don't think anyone teaches this sequence today. If someone does, please let me know. But the combination of poses in Pradipika is, I don't know how you would even go about teaching it. You know, you've got contortion-like poses where the legs behind the head. You've got calisthenics-like poses where you're doing planche that requires immense amount of training to achieve. And then you've got more simple poses and meditation. So yeah, I find that really interesting. Whether creative sequencing has a place in yoga, I think really depends on your intention. Would you agree?
I think so, your intention. And maybe without intention, maybe some teachers are doing it or including it, maybe.
Yeah, so I think you can ask yourself this question. If you want to sequence creatively, why do I want to sequence creatively? And does this intention align with the intention and values of yoga? So it can absolutely have a place in yoga if your intentions align. But if the answer you gave is not aligned with the teachings of yoga, then maybe you can reconsider or have a longer think about what's behind all of this. Because maybe you want to be impressive, and that comes from a place of lack or comparison. Maybe Lucy in your yoga studio teaches wonderful creative flows and she gets more students than you, right? maybe it comes from a place of boredom. So, not appreciating the interest in the simple things that we practice. And I think to sequence creatively with skill, we need to be super familiar with the steadiness and the focus of a simple practice. Can you think of any other examples of when your intention could not be aligned with the teachings of yoga?
Yeah, I think you definitely named a few that I thought of. I think what I'm noticing from being a teacher in, I don't know if my location of living in Los Angeles has anything to do with it, but there seems to be, this is my perception, pressure, the expectations to be creating a different, unique, new, unseen creative
Hmm.
sequencing every week for your class. Your
Hmm.
students are expecting it, and that's how, that's a marker of you being a great teacher, is how different and unique and creative your sequence are each week, that it's going to be different than what anybody else is teaching. And this is my perception of it, but I think there's a lot of pressure that yoga teachers feel, that every week we have to come up with this new, different creative sequencing that students going to like and appreciate. So that is definitely something I notice. And that can also lead teachers to burnout, because they feel like they run into this creative block, like something is getting in the way for them to keep creating new sequences that is different. There's that pressure, I feel like, and expectations that teachers are dealing with.
Yeah, so I want to tell you about how my intention aligns with in creative sequencing aligns, but from what you're saying, it's that studio pressure potentially that might put you in this position where you feel like you have to keep creating a new, complicated, unseen class every single week. But what I do notice from my background in contemporary dance is we get this expectation put on us, whether it's from us or from the studio, but we never get hardly ever get educated in the 200-hour training as to how to keep and stay creative. There are different techniques you can use that in contemporary dance you just do every single day, because creative dance purpose is to stay as creative as you can. And creativity does not exist in a vacuum. You have to practice it. It's just like yoga practice, that you have to practice creativity to have more creative ideas. Yeah, so I think that's really interesting.
Yes, and can you share with the listeners how they can continue to, how can they practice their creativity?
Yeah, so to enhance your creativity, you need to make time for something I call play practice. And in a dance setting, it would be called improvisation practice, but that term puts people off sometimes. So I just call it play practice. And that's where you move creatively without an outcome. You can do an open improvisation where you just move, or you can set yourself a task. So, for example, in a yoga context, you could be like, I'm going to go on my mat and find all the ways I can possibly think of to get in and out of Warrior 2. And maybe some of them are silly and you're not going to use them at the end of the day, but that's fine. You've engaged in that creative process of coming up with ideas, which then makes you better next time you have a problem to solve creatively. Um, but if you have an open improvisation, there is a big value to keeping it just that. So, no thinking mind involved, you're just engaging in creative movement on your mat. And maybe some ideas come out of that. You can write them down, you can film yourself if it doesn't put you off. But also, you just make time for creative practice. And that's what you do when you have your 30 minutes free.
I love that idea. I think it's a maybe great incentive for yoga teachers to, I think it's always so important to have like self practice. So, like when you just practice for yourself, sometimes when you're not even trying to come up with sequences, when you just kind of listen to your body and just move on your yoga mat, that's also sometimes I feel like a great ideas can come, is kind of moving without expectations and just kind of following your intuition or sensations in your body.
Yeah. Do you want to go into other things that we can do to improve our creativity,
Yes.
which is applicable not just to creative sequencing? I think any vinyasa sequencing, for example, could benefit from this. So apart from plate practice, I would definitely go and take a class with someone who inspires you. And we've all felt this. You go to someone else's class, you think there's no transition in the worlds that you can't think of right now. And then that person gives you that transition, and you're like, what? I didn't even think of this. It's so simple sometimes. Yeah, so you could perhaps borrow this idea, but often what happens, which you'll probably know, is that gives you six other ideas of what you could do in your next class. So I think coming to other people's classes is another good way to stay inspired.
Yes, I totally agree. I think taking other teachers' classes are always so, especially when you're feeling uninspired or burnt out, or you feel like you've been doing the same thing over and over again. Taking classes from teachers, maybe new teachers you haven't taken of, or a teacher that you know you can always get inspired from whenever you take this teacher's class, I think is a great way. And sometime I feel like I'll take a class and didn't like it, did not like it at all. And that can give me, like, that will give me deeper inquiry of like, why didn't I like that? How come this didn't feel good to me? And that inquiry can maybe lead to how you could make a sequence that is going to feel better in your body or that feels more, smooth or so it can go both.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so valid. Definitely. Either way, you can be inspired, even from a class that you consider wasn't appropriate for you, didn't feel so good, but you can come up with things. Yeah. I could also expand this and actually say go to class in any other movement discipline, not just yoga classes. And there's so much inspiration to be found in other movement disciplines. I don't know how much you practice other things, but like dance, acrobatics, circus, even functional fitness, strength training, Pilates could be all amazing places of inspiration. I think if you teach bodies to move and make shapes, it's so worthwhile to keep this open-minded attitude, and and that will enhance your teaching. It also brings the wider community of movement professionals together, which I love. But yeah, I think it just allows you to open your mind a little bit and see what's out there and taste a little bit of that variety that exists.
Yeah, so true. So I think that what you just said made me, I was able to relate in different ways because I don't come from dancing background. I don't have any dance. Well, I used to dance salsa and bachata, but not, professionally or not. It wasn't anything I grew up doing. It just kind of hobby I picked up when I was in my 20s for a little bit. So I don't really consider myself as like a quote unquote dancer or have dancing background or knowledge, training. So sometimes it's really hard for me to relate to some yoga teachers as well as maybe some of the creative sequencing because a lot of yoga teachers do come from dance background and I can see how they weave in this dance background into their sequencing and I'm like, wow, this is really beautiful. They look beautiful doing it. They look so like smooth and flawless. And I just never really felt like that was me. I felt more rigid and tight and da 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 da. But what you just said about how you can borrow different movements from different movement modalities doesn't have to be yoga. It could be this like functional movement, or maybe it's this like little fun exercises that you learned in PT office when you injured your shoulders. Maybe it's like how, learning how to functional range of motion movement and exercises that you can do. And that really made me kind of think about, oh yeah, I do that. I do bring in those things in my yoga classes, although it may not be in transitions, but I do bring it into a certain pose. It's like, oh, let's try this pose, try doing it this way, or can we try to engage this muscle as we do this pose and pull this heels this way, or all these things. So that made me feel like, oh yeah, I do that. So that was hopefully listeners who's listening who also feel like they don't have a dance background and they don't really feel like their flow is this like beautiful flowy class. Hopefully somebody can relate that there's still a way to bring that creativity and borrowing different movement practices into yoga class.
Yeah, and there's so many ways to be creative with your creative flow, and what I'm describing comes down to my experience and history with contemporary dance, which is what feels natural and embodied for me. And there's some teaching in that. But if you have done parkour your whole life, maybe those movement patterns that you've learned there is something that inspires you to teach yoga in that way, you know? And who's to say that that's not creative or that's wrong? Which actually, my last point, I think, from this would be just continuing your education or learning more is going to be the thing that also keeps you motivated. So whether that's going to someone's class or trying other movement disciplines, just educating yourself in other ways, like going to courses. Maybe you are listening to podcasts, reading some book about movement. There are so many things that could inspire you, especially if you've done your 200 hour. Maybe you don't have a ton of experience, like you say, in any other discipline. I would say to continue learning and to continue learning anatomy as well can be so inspiring. I constantly am inspired by how muscles work and what's happening in the body when I do something. And I'm like, can I craft a class around all the ranges of motion of my scapula? And then I sit down and go, wow, this is so exciting and interesting. So yeah, I think anatomy will give you some inspiration. It will also help you make your teaching more methodical because you can analyze what you're doing and then apply that knowledge to your teaching. So it will improve your sequences through inspiration or through analysis. Either is very useful, right?
Yes, definitely. I think continuing to learn, continuing to expand your knowledge, especially in anatomy, I think is a key definitely for coming up with creative sequencing, but not only creative, but sequencing that feels good in the body or doesn't feel awkward or doesn't feel, it almost feels right rather than going against the natural movement maybe. Well, everyone's natural movement is different, but I think having a knowledge and background in some kind of anatomy or biomechanics can help so much with coming up with sequencing that feels good for students.
Yeah. Yeah.
And thank you so much, Olga, for sharing all of this. I feel like there's so much good points, and I feel like I can kind of think and marinate on a lot of these points that you have mentioned. Next week, we are going to chat about the pitfalls and maybe some issues that we might come across, or maybe you have experience maybe in some creative sequencing. So let's chat next week about the pitfall, and I will talk to you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast and conversation I had with Olga. Next week will be the third episode on creative sequencing with Olga. I hope you're enjoying this series. If you have any questions about anything we talked about or just want to give us a review or rating, I so much appreciate if you could put a 5-star rating, review, subscribe, anything that you can on Spotify or Apple or anywhere you're listening to this podcast from. And I hope everybody is being safe. And maybe this week I encourage you to reach out to somebody you know, somebody you love, and say that you love them. Maybe reach out to hang out with your friends to really continue to cultivate and strengthen the community around you. So that is it from me today. Have a lovely rest of your week, and I'll speak to you next week.